Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar weekly discussion topic video. This time I'm going to be doing part 5 to a series that I did a while ago, and that is, in this case, it's going to be my North and South in review. So I've previously done my look back videos on The Promise, on The Search, on The Rift, and Smoke and Shadow. Now I'm going to finish up the current Avatar comics that we have with North and South in review. So if you remember from a few months ago when I did this series, the way I do this is that I start off with a brief little discussion of my thoughts, plus how in general the fandom received it. Then I kind of run through the books, basically doing a brief recap, just kind of like myself reading through the pages, pretty quickly, and giving my thoughts on it as we go, and then ending with some final thoughts. So it's going to be a long-ish video, but I think it's worthwhile to do, because obviously the North and South Library Edition has just been released, so it's a kind of perfect time to go back to North and South. So, when it was first announced, I think there was a decent amount of excitement about this, because immediately it was clear it's going to be Sokka and Katara returning to the South for the first time since basically the start of the series. There's going to be a lot of nostalgia going on here as we return to that location we haven't seen in a very long time. And, there was excitement because there was going to be a lot of fun interactions. We're getting to see like Hakoda again, Paku again, getting to see just a few of those things that they maybe set up with the Water Tribe and see how they really come into play. What does it look like now? How do Katara and Sokka deal with that? And, little things like, if Aang arrives, there should be some fun interactions of like everyone who knows Katara interacting, dealing with the fact that she has a boyfriend now and stuff like that. And I think ultimately some of those things came true, others didn't. In that, yes, it's a Katara-focused book, but it's not really a Sokka-focused book. Aang comes back in, but their relationship isn't really a focus. It's just kind of like Aang comes in and is the Avatar, and it's fine. In a way, you didn't need a lot of the other characters. It kind of should have, I think, in the end, just been a Water Tribe story. And given what we now know, I kind of get the impression that a lot of the extra characters that come in as like part 2 and 3 progress very much are there because this is Gene Yang and Team Guruhuru's last book. That they wanted to end their run on the comics by having everyone have this kind of happy moment at the end. Whereas I think if they knew that they were going on for more comics, maybe this would have been a bit more focused on the Water Tribe stuff. It would have been more Katara. Sokka might have had an arc going on here. And maybe there was no need for like Toph Zuko to arrive. I could still see them using Aang because it made sense for Aang to return to this place that he must see as being somewhat special to him as well, because it was like his return to the world. And because of his connection to Katara, it would make sense that he, sees somewhat of a family kind of dynamic within the South. But they didn't really play with that all that much, so that didn't really become a factor in the book. And in terms of fan reaction, now that the series is over, in general, I think, like myself, most fans consider this to be the weakest of the 5 main comic series, because it is so, in a way, focused, but also unfocused on just, like, Katara's character arc for the most part. The highlights that everyone, I think, points to, including myself, would be Katara's relationship with Hakoda. Melina is actually a surprisingly really good character. They explore some interesting ideas at the start, but ultimately, come the end, they completely lose track of what on earth the series was, to the point where I would say that the book's biggest flaw is that it doesn't really feel like it has a main plot, because it goes back and forth on what it's really trying to do, and it ends in a point where, ultimately, the start to the finish of this book, has anything substantial really happened? Outside of, like Katara's character arc, basically, has anything of note particularly happened? By the end of this book, like, Gilak is dead, but so much of the issues that he presented, not resolved, not addressed. Katara still has issues with what's happened to the tribe and what's going on, but she's more accepting of it. Melina and Hakoda's relationship is in, like, a strong place still, but that's really it. Like, there's nothing big that happens here, and I think that's the biggest problem. all of the other comic series have a really, really clear main plot and kind of what you're going to get at the end. This one doesn't. And because of that, it makes it feel like, yeah, this was not the best. And I think that's why it's the weakest, because it is overall the one where I think there's the least amount of reason to go back and read this one, because there ultimately is so little that is substantial to the overall universe going forward. But we'll get into it. I'll point out the good parts and the bad parts as we kind of go through. So we start off with kind of Katara in a dream sequence where she remembers her mother, and I do like this, that ultimately like it's kind of a bookmark on the series of like Katara and her relationship with her mother, her memories of her mother, and kind of what that means. And the idea is, of course, that this is how she envisions how the tribe will look when she returns. It'll be still a small-ish place, but there'll be much more, houses, igloos, and it will be like just bigger than it was before. But her mother's there. That's the key thing, that she in her mind envisions her mother being there as like that's how the tribe is when it's working properly outside of war. The problem is that her mother's not there. The problem is that, as we learn later on, neither Katara nor Gran, nor basically anyone still alive, has ever really, at this point, knows what the Southern Water Tribe was like in a time before the war. Because it was a 100-year war, they don't actually know what the tribe looked like really before that, because it was so, hit by war constantly at this point. So it's one of those really unique situations of just like, of course things are going to be very different now with a kind of combined southern-northern effort to kind of rebuild the town, the village, and it's going to really shock Katara and Sokka, of course. And she wakes up and, they basically very quickly arrive back at the port. And just the fact that there is a port in the Southern Water Tribe is kind of a big moment of, like, oh, that's showing progress, that there's an actual, like, built port and it's not just them arriving on, this ice shelf type thing. Yeah, we get a fun, nostalgic moment of penguin sledding where, like, Sokka and Katara go penguin sledding. And, Katara obviously remembers this being one of the key early moments with Aang. They go back and see a lot of building work being done, and you have this kind of joint, Northern Water Tribe and an Earthbender kind of crew, and some kids messing around, and we get into a little scuffle that mainly goes to show how powerful Katara is, that even though she's up against benders here, she is so much more powerful than them, and they are actually just kind of make the point of like they're just trying to do their work and continue to build. But they arrive back in what is effectively their village, where their village was, and it's this huge, this massive city that is now there. It is not as big as the Northern Water Tribe, but it is like 25-50 times larger than what Katara's dream was in the kind of at the start of the book. And it's this huge unexpected thing that it's changed this much. And they're originally kind of like, whoa, or Katara says our village is gone, but Sokka says no, it's not gone, it's just better. And thankfully Katara's kind of distracted from this immediately because she meets her aunt Ashina, and very quickly everyone begins to see them, and like they're always happy to see them because Katara and Sokka are celebrities at this point. They're heroes. They in many ways allowed this to happen. They are two of the most famous people from the Southern Water Tribe ever, and they're treated like that here. And we have Gran, we get the reunion there. We also get Paku arriving, and the fact that the two of them got married, and they actually kind of went off and got married at the Misty Palms Oasis. And then Paku makes this like mention of like, I'm training waterbending students, and there's this really interesting thing going on, which they leave it there for this part, but they do come back to later on and inform us that what that is of course that there are actually other southern waterbenders out there that he's found and he's training them. So it's not just northern waterbenders who have moved down to the south to be trained. There are just actually now younger kids growing up who are now southern waterbenders as well. Because I think that's the thing that's easy to forget, that as much as, Katara was the last waterbender in her tribe, there were still a lot of, like, kids in the tribe. So there is a chance, of course, for more waterbenders to still come out. It wasn't necessarily this, like, extinction type thing like it was with airbending and Aang. Obviously here they take a slightly different road and actually say that there were actually other tribes more away from where, Katara and Sokka's tribe was. But then they meet their father again, who obviously is revealed to be, the head chieftain of the entire Southern Water Tribe, because obviously it's so big now that it's not necessarily just this idea of, like, being like a tribal chieftain. He's now the official chieftain of the entire Southern Water Tribe, which I was hoping that this book would give us the clarification on what exactly the difference between, like, Southern Water Tribe leader, the chief, and the Northern Water Tribe chief was, and kind of clarify why it is the way it is in Korra time, because obviously we know the whole situation with the Water Tribe. The Southern Tribe formed from the Northern Tribe because of the whole rule situation, but because of the way that they separated, the Southern Tribe isn't, like, necessarily, like, recognized as such by the North, but they're obviously developed a relationship over time. So it was always the case where, like, the Northern Water Tribe leader was the overall leader of the Water Tribe on, like, a worldwide scale, whereas the Southern Tribe was more of just, like, a tribal leader. But now you can sort of see that the position of Southern Chief is becoming more of a thing. But then how on earth does it get to a point where, like, Unalaq is the chief of both tribes and then it's just completely unrecognized in Korra's time? They needed to make that kind of clarification. And, you have a little moment from Katara here where she's noting that, like, this is so not Dad to have this giant office to himself and be like this. Clearly the issue that Katara's facing is that she wanted it to still be, the small tribe, and be more tribal, where it's more like a city location now. But we're then introduced to Melina and Malik, who are, of course, those two are brother and sister, and we eventually get the idea that Melina and Hakoda are in a relationship. That's kind of like one of the key reveals towards the end of the book, and have been for a decent amount of time. But initially it's just this idea of, like, they have come to help with the, the Southern Reconstruction Project, and they're both from the Northern Water Tribe, and they kind of both reveal that they both spent more of their time in the Earth Kingdom. I think they both at one point say they went to Ba Sing Se University. And they're really nice initially, like they talk about, all the legends of what they did on their journeys, and they kind of impress them. The builders come in and it looks like there's going to be this big argument because they met before, but quickly it calms down, and we get to the idea that next up on the kind of the docket basically to be built is going to be a palace, a Southern Water Tribe palace. And Sokka's excited about this, Katara isn't. And it's this idea that this is going to be ultimately where the ruler of the South actually rules from, which we know roughly becomes a thing. It's not the same design that they have here, but something, similar comes into play later on. Again, it's a bit like, it's a setup for something that's very murky and we don't really know a lot about, so it doesn't have as much meaning now because it is just this, like, picture on a plan. But anyway, the idea is that, the South and the North are kind of working together, but little things that Melina is saying, and that, like, even though she's a very nice person, she's still saying these things about, like, oh, you in the South, you need this because you're not like us, and she's kind of looking down on them and not respecting their more tribal culture, and she expects them to just immediately want the more modern culture, whereas Sokka, you can see, kind of wants Katara, more wants things to be the way they were. Melina instantly kind of puts, Sokka in charge of, like, he's, like, consulting on the construction crew projects because he's, like, an idea guy. But it goes nowhere. Like, I think Sokka in this book, they really didn't have anything for him, and it becomes a little bit of a problem, and it just, like, I don't think Jin Yang, Team Gurihuru, Mike and Brian, during this era of comics, really ever had an idea for Sokka to really have an arc of his own. Because I thought what they would have done here would be more move him into a position where maybe he'd be like Hakoda's right-hand man, and he'd be like very much right there in terms of assisting with all these projects, setting him up as the next leader of the tribe or something like that. But they don't in any way really attempt to use Sokka all that much in a leadership position. Melina sort of puts him in charge, but we never see him actually like do any work in relation to this. It's just kind of to show that Sokka immediately like accepts Melina and there's no problem whatsoever. Anyway, they are invited out for a meal, and at the meal, you know, it's more of the same, where you get the idea of Melina again saying things about how like the Southern Water Tribe food is different than northern food, and you know, again showing a lack of subtlety maybe with regards to approaching relations between the two tribes. Nothing like so offensive that you hate her, but just enough where like it shows that she maybe doesn't get it. She doesn't get why people would be annoyed at kind of her saying a lot of this stuff. But anyway, we see this plan go into action where two youngish members of the Water Tribe come in. They kind of spill stuff, and in the distraction they steal Malik's briefcase. And this becomes a really important plot point as they escape. You know, Melina ends up getting kind of knocked over. She hits her head off something, is kind of temporarily knocked out. A big chase scene occurs where like Sokka and Katara chase after the two kids who stole the briefcase. There's some cool water bending stuff. There's some cool kind of like riding on a sled type stuff, as they basically end up next to the crashed Fire Nation ship from the legendary one that we know about, the haunted shipwreck. And they go inside because it's obviously clear that that's where the kids went, and they find basically a passage underneath the ice, and it's here they meet Gilak, who is revealed to be, yes, he's from the Southern Water Tribe, and he used to be a key member of, you know, Hakoda's kind of you know, fighting team. They used to kind of be warriors together, as you know, the Southern military basically. And it's established that they used to be kind of pretty close friends, and here we get the idea that he runs this kind of group of like Southern patriots who really oppose all of this kind of the South interacting with the other nations, and kind of is like an isolationist more or less for the tribe, and wanting to keep their customs as they are and no changes whatsoever. We get introduced to his second in command, Thawd, here, who you know, keeps the old stories alive, and you know, we sort of get his ideals here, and again, I think Gilak is a much more interesting character early on than later on, in that the biggest problem that this book as a series overall has is that they turn what is ultimately like this very idealistic guy who has these quite interesting ideals that you can sort of understand, and by the end of the book they just turn him into a madman trying to kill Hakoda. And along the way they just completely like neuter him as a threat, that any people following him, yeah, they're just wrong, we'll just ignore them, they're just doing what they're doing, you know, we'll fix that eventually, kind of type thing. Like, Gilak was crazy, so the people who follow him are just crazy and we'll just let it happen. And it just feels like that was the entire threat of this book, and you just take it away completely come the end of the book. But initially it's very interesting about you know, what he talks about, how like, you know, if we stay too egalitarian like the air nomads, we might get wiped out, and we have to be much stronger. We need a powerful leader that is going to, you know, protect the interests of the South and, you know, get rid of the cowards from the North, basically. And he's really not along the idea of like the North being the sister tribe to the South and so on. And, you know, Katara obviously brings up the idea of like, what about the Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation coming together to build a new society and so on. That's kind of where the world is going. And this is more of the old way that Gilak has. And he talks about how, you know, they're trying to make us a cheap imitation. And ultimately, like some of this hits Katara, in that some of the ideas of what he's talking about obviously work well with what kind of Katara is thinking about her initial impressions of coming home and seeing the way things are. It's just obviously she never goes to that extreme. But it's interesting how they approach it. The other thing with this is him as a threat, physically, not at all. Because Katara and Sokka on their own managed to basically be captured, escape, and defeat almost everyone they meet along the way with basically no problem. And so, as you start introducing characters like Toph comes in, Aang comes in, Zuko comes in, and you have other characters like Hakoda involved and other Water Tribe warriors, how on earth are we really meant to see these people as a threat? What are they actually meant to be by the end of this series, I think is the main question. Just as they escape, they do meet Thawd on the way out, and he tells them the story, which thematically I think works, but I was hoping that they'd more build upon this and maybe give us a flashback. I was really hoping that one of the big things that this series would do would be tell us the origin of the South and how it's separated from the North, and basically address the initial issues between both tribes. Because the book is called North and South, but come the end of it, like, you're not really ever thinking so much about the North, because there's Melina and Malik, basically, and they're the only real two northern characters as such in the book. And so they're meant to basically be the north section of this, with the whole idea that, like, okay, there's Paku as well, and in general the north are kind of changing the south, and that's meant to be kind of what the book is about. But I just don't get why, like, you introduce all these other characters and have it be about world leaders, but never once does the idea of, like, Chief Arnuk coming into play, the actual chief of the north, and actually addressing what the issue is between the tribes, because fundamentally, like, there is no issue on, like, the northern side as such. They're maybe a little bit misguided in terms of trying to change the South to more or less be a carbon copy of themselves, but there's no, like, ill intent as such. And then the way they approach Gilak is that they definitely make it out that it's primarily extremists that are with him, so it kind of really takes away from kind of what the story's meant to be. But Thought's story here is, he talks about here, once upon a time a snow rat learned to talk and walk on his hind feet. The humans found him entertaining, so they invited him to sit at their campfire. After a while, the snow rat forgot that he was a snow rat at all. He asked for a home for himself, and a fishing boat, and a place on the tribal council. But humans never forgot that he was a snow rat. They were insulted by his requests, so they chased him away back into the cold, where he forever shivered and gnashed his teeth, haunted by memories of humans' campfires. And the idea here is that he's talking about the difference between the North and the South. The North are the humans, the South are the snow rats, and regardless of what relationship is trying to be formed here, the North are always going to consider the South to be snow rats. They might give them a little bit, allow them to sit on the council, but it'll always be this case where they're always just treated as, you know, the less evolved, you know, the less important group, which is really interesting. It's just, again, it kind of just falls away come part 3. But anyway, they escape. There's a pretty cool chase scene with some animals, snow leopard, caribou, and you know, Katara brings up some of the points of, like, you know, Gilak does have sort of a point. I don't agree with everything, but, you know, I could see the problem, and, you know, this is where Sokka brings up the idea of, like, this just looks like progress to me. And then she remembers basically the last time this came up, which is back in the Rift, and she remembers how Aang felt when he found the, you know, the Air Nomad sacred kind of plane, and the fact that the refinery, the Earth refinery back in the Rift was kind of, you know, had basically taken over that place, ruined that, you know, sacred location, and had changed it, and how she was kind of, I think, during that time, you know, obviously caring about how Aang felt about it, but was understanding of, like, I suppose, why it was in place. And here she is directly dealing with something similar. And she kind of wishes Aang was here, because obviously he at this point is obviously dealing with the stuff in Smoke and Shadow. That's where he is. They're kind of happening at the same time. Anyway, they couldn't get the briefcase back, and, you know, they just talk about how Malik kind of has a bit of a rant here about how, you know, if this was in the North, there'd be so much more police action and so on, and he really gets the idea that he starts to present the idea that he, of the two, of Melina and him, he really isn't a fan of how different things are in the South, which makes him an interesting character. in terms of what they do with him in part 2, but obviously there's some problems that come up, which we'll get to. But anyway, they go in to talk to Melina, who's obviously like recovering from her bump on the head, and Katara and Sokka walk in to find Hakoda and Melina kissing. So this is the big reveal at the end of part 1, that they are actually a couple. So we switch over to part 2 at this point, with basically Hakoda investigating the ship and where Gilak is, apparently. And all he finds there is basically they're empty, they're gone from where they were before, and a message on the wall that says, "Soon I will show you the truth, chieftain." Here we see a little bit of kind of awkwardness from Sokka and Katara about Melina, and Sokka being very mature about it, that only dad gets to choose who's right for dad and so on. Whereas I think Katara's just immediately thinking about what if she replaces mom? What if they got married? What would that mean? And here we get the idea that they're building all of this stuff, and the reason the North are kind of showing an interest in the South is because there's a huge oil deposit here under the ice in the South, and they're here to basically extract it, and this will lift up the South, apparently. And obviously Katara doesn't like the idea of the tribe needing to be lifted up and this being the way to do it. Malik obviously is very intent on this, talking about how this is an advancement, this is all about machines, and with all this extra oil they can do more and more machines. And it starts the idea of kind of basically a little bit of the equalist movement type stuff going on here. You won't understand because you're a bender, the power you possess, but if we can use machines, that can really help non-benders kind of be as powerful as benders, and it will make us equal and stuff like that. And Sokka obviously agrees with this. He, there's a forklift there, and then this is when we get the introduction of Toph into it. She's basically the representative for the Earth and Fire refinery, obviously from the Rift. And she's here. She obviously has to wear shoes because it's cold and she'd get frostbite on her feet, so she's a little bit limited in terms of her bending, but it's not really brought up too much as a plot point. It's just it's not massive, it's massively incredible, but she can still see okay, basically. And I think ultimately with Toph's involvement in this, it's fine. They involve her, they later introduce her metal bending students, and they play an interesting role in terms of the fighting. Character-wise, there's nothing really here for the most part. There's one point, I think, at the start of episode of the third part where I'll bring up something, but in general, this is just, as I said before, the idea of Jean Yang bringing the whole crew together for this mission, even though they don't really need everyone here. I like the idea that this is kind of meant to be a partnership between, obviously, Melina and Malik's kind of, construction crew, and then the Earth and Fire refinery. Again, all over the oil and stuff like that, and what they're trying to do here. But they go to the festival that night, and they kind of, Sokka and Toph go off. They play with all the games, and then this is where we come back to the plot point of Pakku training waterbenders again. He comes up to Katara and introduces her to his two new students, Siku and Sura. He introduces Katara as possibly the finest in all the world in terms of a waterbender, and they talk about how the two girls talk about how we're not actually benders, and you can see that they kind of run off and they're acting really weird. And this is where Pakku says something quite interesting. Gran and I found them in a tiny village east of here. They live about as far inland as a tribe can, well out of sight from shore. And he knows that they're benders because if you look off in the distance, they're kind of playing together, doing some water bending. And Pakku says it's like they don't want to share their water bending with anyone but themselves. And that's really, for the most part, all you kind of get with it. This is such a small plot point throughout the entire book. It's like one page almost in each of the parts is devoted to this plot point of there being southern waterbenders. They try to use the fact that they're kind of afraid to kind of be who they want to be as a plot point, and it works to a degree, but they could have, I think, done it a lot better. I think they needed a little bit more flashback and just context given, but anyway, what happens next is obviously Hakoda's guarding the festival. He's not participating because he knows Gilak is probably going to try something because of the message from earlier on. And this is where we get into some of the best stuff in the whole series, and that is Katara and Hakoda talking about things. And they have a sit down here, and it's really nice how it goes. Katara is really embarrassed about it initially, and Hakoda's just like, it's about Melina, isn't it? And she's like, yeah, why didn't you tell us about her? And he says, I should have, I'm sorry about that, but I wasn't sure if you and Sokka were ready. And then kind of Katara turns it around and is kind of like, but are you ready? Kind of like, are you ready to move on? And she says basically, I don't get why you chose her. And he says, I know Melina can come across as gruff. And Katara says, it's not just that, Dad. I get gruff. I'm friends with Toph. Melina doesn't really understand us, as in like the Southern Water Tribe. And she says, honestly, I don't trust her. What if she's up to something nefarious? And Hakoda just says, Katara, I assure you, Melina is a lot of things, but nefarious isn't one of them. Even if you don't trust her, you have to trust me, okay? Melina still has a lot to learn about our way of life, but deep down inside she has a good heart. I wouldn't have fallen in love with her otherwise. And she just says, but maybe that's the problem, Dad. No offense, but what if you're blinded by your feelings? And he says, you're old enough to talk about, that we can talk about these things, but you know what it's like to be in love, right? And she's like, yeah. So you know that right kind of love, the kind that's real, that sacrifices, that kind of love doesn't blind you, it actually helps you see. As Aang on Appa returns, and she's so excited to return, and the idea being that, I suppose, like, on her own, she's making these, like, assumptions about Melina, and maybe with the clarity maybe that Aang being around will give her, like she kind of addressed in part 1 a little bit, that she wishes Aang was here, maybe she'll be able to see things a bit differently now in terms of like their relationship coming together, setting up things. And it's just a nice moment as you see Hakoda obviously happy to see Aang and Katara reunited, and it's a nice moment of just how he comes in like, can I kiss you, and not in front of my dad, and he just basically gives the context of like, this is what happened in Smoke and Shadow, but I'm back now, and so on. He obviously says hello to Hakoda, and just nice little interaction between Aang's, I suppose, soon to be father and so on. But yeah, they just get the idea, like, Aang immediately gets involved in things. Hakoda's gonna still stay guard as Aang and Katara go off to enjoy the festival. And I really like this little moment at the end here where Katara goes, my dad's always been kind to you, hasn't he? And Aang says, yeah, of course, why do you ask? As he looks back at him and says, I just been thinking I ought to do the same for him. Basically that, like, Hakoda's been nothing but supportive of Aang and Katara's relationship, and here she is kind of making it out that, like, the person Hakoda's in a relationship with is doing all this evil stuff. She ought to give him the same level of, like, kind of respect and kind of give Melina a chance. So immediately she goes up to Melina and just thanks her for inviting them to the festival. They're having fun. And, we get the idea that, like, Aang's here, and Katara just says, I'll be happy to introduce you if you like. But Melina and Malik have to give their big announcement. And this is, I suppose, the big moment in terms of, like, the middle of the book, the key moment from part 2 of the series, where it feels like the plot is really being presented to us. And what happens next, this is going to be what the series is fundamentally about. And it is, right up until, like, part 3, where they don't really address most of what's presented here. And they just leave it to be resolved later. So, she talks about, the reconstruction project, and how she wants to the North will help you make the most of your natural resources, so you can finally establish a presence for yourself on the world stage. And what we see is that the audience isn't really sure about what this means. They're, like, clapping, but they're like, making use of our natural resources in the best way possible. What does that really mean? And she's going to announce the venture, like, that the Earth and Fire Industries will be, like, coming together with them. And Toph is about to get up on stage and basically announce that section of the deal as Gilak comes in on his drill, and that he's, like, drilled into the festival. And he kind of takes over here and basically, takes control of everything and makes his kind of counter speech to this, because this is where the briefcase comes back into things. He's read what's in the briefcase. He knows what the actual plan for the South is, and it's a bit harsher than what necessarily they've been talking about. And he basically says, they're here to subjugate and humiliate us. They want to strip our land and destroy everything that we are. He brings up the oil, and he says that they're just going to claim it for the North, and like none of it will basically be used by the South. And he says, this is when he brings up the documents from the briefcase. And basically he says that their plan is to make the Southern Water Tribe a colony of the North. And Melina obviously kind of says, like, no, that's not what it is. And she's like, no, that's not our plan. And she says, but it used to be. We never used the word colony, but we did worry that the South wasn't ready to handle such an important resource. We were wrong. And this is where the idea comes in that, like, this is the kind of fractious moment between Melina and Malik, where Melina obviously has been somewhat taken in a little bit by the different culture of the South. That maybe she doesn't like every aspect of it, but she likes them the way they are. So she's kind of asked for the plan to be changed from more kind of, in a way, like, we'll take control of everything, to more helping the South to kind of help themselves. Whereas this is where Malik reveals, I told you, I tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen, Melina. I never destroyed those documents. I never cancelled the plans. And he's been keeping this from her, and, he basically says that Gilak speaks the truth, that the oil in the ground will be under Northern control, and it's what has to be done. And he basically just gets Gilak more and more angry at him and so on. And he basically talks about how the oil changes everything. It's the pathway to a future of equality, and we can't trust the future to a culture so mired in the past. So it's this weird idea of, like, he's so into this idea of making non-benders the same as benders in terms of how powerful they are with machines, that he's gone as far as to, like, betray his sister, lie to her about the plans that they have. And he's basically putting a target on his back against Gilak, but I think he's turning the entire South against him. And Melina quickly realizes this, and he's about to just completely dig his own grave here, when Melina just screams at him and just says, stop talking. And she basically apologizes and says that, we'll step down from this immediately, we'll leave first thing in the morning, it's clear that this isn't going to work, and she's prepared to just kind of abandon everything, leave it as it was, to just stop any incident happening. And Gilak obviously doesn't agree with this, and orders his men to attack. And this is where the fight breaks out, and we get kind of scuffles kind of all over the place. Hakoda realizes what's going on, he rushes back into play. Aang's here, so there's a bit more firepower at play. We see that Melina's kind of crew is more working for Malik, and so kind of betrays everyone. And, Thawd, during this scuffle, talks to Katara and says, they may flatter you with pretty words, they may even put together a lovely festival, but make no mistake, in their eyes you'll never be anything more than a snow rat. And he asks her, will you support Gilak's cause? And she says no. She gets chi-blocked initially by Thawd, which is the big reveal. That's like a special technique that some members of Gilak's forces actually have. Aang shows how powerful he is. Toph shows how powerful she is. Sokka gets a little bit of action here with his boomerang. And we cut back to Katara, and how she deals with Thawd is that she bends with her legs, whereas her arms were what was chi-blocked. And, everyone kind of comes back together, and they find basically that the person who is basically about to be taken out here is Melina and Malik, who are kind of captured by other people on the outside. And Gilak is about to just swing his kind of sword thing down on them and kill them. And that basically saying that you two need to serve as an example of what the new Southern Water Tribe under new leadership is going to be like. It's going to be strong in the face of everything. He says, your demise will be a warning to all foreign powers who think they can trample over our people, and they need to think again. But Hakoda steps in to block him, and we get some of their dynamic going on here. And he basically says that Hakoda knew that this was part of the plan for Melina and so on. And he basically talks here about how, because after she got to know our people, she changed her mind. Firelord Zuko was once our sworn enemy, now he's one of our fiercest allies. I believe people can change. And Gilak just basically reverses this and says, I believe people can change too, because you've changed, as they kind of fight. And it's clear that Hakoda has the advantage here. He's the more skilled of the two, but he's still willing to give Gilak a chance. He's not just going to take him out here. He wants to help him, basically Gilak, to help him work together. And, basically he says, so let's talk through this, Gilak, as brothers. And as he goes to shake his hand, Gilak takes out a knife and stabs Hakoda. And it's this really emotional moment right at the end. Katara gets very emotional. Melina has a big emotional reaction. Obviously, everyone gets captured at this point. All of Gilak's forces basically get captured. Katara immediately goes to heal Hakoda, and we see him recovering in Gran Gran and Paku's house. And Gran Gran has a little line here. She says, this isn't good. You coming to visit my hut twice in 2 days. This isn't good at all. Wounds flow from wrong actions flow from wrong beliefs. Someone needs to re-examine their beliefs. And it continues the trend of Sokka and Katara being on opposing sides of this thing. He agrees with the progress, she doesn't. And, she basically points out that Melina and Malik, their plan is not what we need. And Sokka's like, yeah, they were a little bit all over the place, but the oil is good. We need to use the oil. And Sokka just says, we got to get with the times. And then Katara says, not if it means forgetting who we are. And on the outside, Melina comes up again. And we see that basically we end part 2 with Katara and Melina's relationship in this very fractured position. After she was willing to give her a chance at the start, any sense of trust that had developed between the two of them is kind of broken now. Even though I think we as the audience know that she was the more open of the two, that Malik is really the person who is the problem here. Melina made some initial choices, but she herself was also betrayed by her brother as well. And we get the idea that, she says, what is it here? I swear to you, all those things my brother said, I don't believe them anymore. And she's like, what do you mean? And Katara says, you don't believe them anymore. Not after you fell in love with my dad. But what happens when you fall out of love, Melina? And she says, Katara, it goes deeper than that. And she's just like, what are you doing here? And he's just like, you came to say goodbye. And we just end with this idea of Hakoda has called Melina in to see him. And she goes in to see Hakoda. We then cut to basically the prison where one of the guards, who is one of Hakoda's guards, releases Gilak from prison. So there's kind of he's gradually beginning to convince more and more people to his side of things, and then on Katara's side of things, she is completely against Melina at this point. Very interesting way to end things. Unfortunately, a lot of the problems with North and South come down to part 3. Part 3 is very much where a lot of things fall apart, and I think it's because in the library edition, Jean Yang says that it was in or around the start of the writing for part 3 where they knew that this was going to be their last book for Avatar. And so it felt like there was a plan if they had more, and this was the plan that they switched to when this was their last one. Because we skip past a ton of stuff between part 2 and 3, and then how we approach dealing with the end is not great at all. So we immediately start with Pengwa, the Dark One, and Hotun, who are obviously Toph's metalbending students, and Toph, and they're helping to build part of the oil refinery, basically. And it's this baffling decision of just wait, what's going on here exactly with the whole situation here? It's really kind of all over the place what exactly is happening here. I'll get to the reasoning behind that in a minute, but anyway, she's helping them with the metal bending. They're kind of struggling because they're in the cold, but she basically just gives them a little bit of a speech that they need to continue on and so on. But this is where Penga brings up, you got to admit it, executive partner Toph, constructing something this big in the middle of all this snow without any waterbenders around to help, kind of crazy. And she just says, but the only southern waterbender in the world isn't interested in helping, and for the time being at least, we can't have any northerners working here. Politics are dumb, but they're still part of business. And it's just like, why is Toph and her Melvin students helping with all of this? In that, like, they're on Katara's side, so why are they helping with the kind of opposition? It's just really weird and unexplained, and that, like, obviously we didn't get Toph's speech about the involvement of the Northern Fire Refinery, but we never get that. We never get the full involvement. They're just that they're helping to build now. And it's just this idea that Melina is staying, but she has to keep a low profile. And she's still going to continue on with the project. And this is where a lot of the resolution off screen happens. Like, Sokka just says a line here, and it's like, Dad's gotten most of the Southerners on board with the project. And I'm just like, that's the plot. The plot is dealing with the fact that you now have people from the South agreeing with Gilak, opposing the North, and opposing his decisions. How can you just so easily say that everyone is on board with the project when there's all these protesters here about these type of things? And he just dismisses them. Sokka just dismisses them. The folks outside the gate, once they see how this will benefit the whole tribe, they'll come around. Really? Just, I don't get it. This is where they definitely make Gilak less important than he was initially. Katara and Aang do a kind of a guest kind of a waterbending class here with the two waterbender girls, and she finally begins to talk about them, and they basically talk about how their mom says that they have one super important rule, and that was never tell anyone about the real us, about the fact that they're waterbenders, and that this is where the stories from the past come up. That if they did show that they were waterbenders, the people from the Fire Nation would take them away. And, Paku came in and, taught them waterbending tricks and so on. And they kind of run off again, that saying that even if they're the Avatar and the Avatar's friend, they're not going to do anything they want to do. And Katara just says, maybe they're not ready for change. They're still so young. Maybe we shouldn't be pushing. But this is where we get some, pretty interesting stuff as like Hakoda comes in. We see he's kind of still somewhat injured, but he's back up on his feet. And we have a pretty nice talk here between Katara and Hakoda, and like Aang's also kind of listening in. And he talks about here, what was it that you guys call yourself again? Team Avatar. And, he basically thanks Team Avatar for saving them. And he says, after getting an up-close view of Team Avatar working together to defeat Gilak, I'm convinced more than ever that the Southern Water Tribe has to collaborate with the other nations to move forward. It took people from all 4 nations to save the world. It will take the same to reconstruct the South. And Katara brings up that, aren't you being a bit naive? Team Avatar is a group of friends, but in this case you're using people like Malik and so on who don't have our best interests at heart. She brings up the idea of like the cheap imitation again. That's what Gilak was saying before. And Aang does point out the idea that Katara has a point. Outside the air nomads, the Southern Water Tribe was hit hardest by the war. That this is something we actually have to think about a lot. And and then he mentions the scene of them training everyone. It's like, but Katara, think about what you were all trying to do back there in the school. A northerner, a southerner, and an air nomad, all working to recover a tradition that was almost lost. It's the kind of collaboration that we need. And he basically says he's already sent out invitations to the Fire and Earth Kingdom to have a conference this evening about kind of the future. And we basically immediately get the arrival of King Kwei and Zuko arriving here. No Suki. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things. Like, when I think the part came out, and I brought this up as a talking point, a few people were just like, it's not really that big of a deal with Suki. But I think over time, this has become a major issue with this book. Given that it was meant to be their celebration of the crew, their last book on together, bringing the whole team back together, why on earth is Suki not here with Zuko? Suki is Zuko's main bodyguard. He's going to a place where they know going in that he's not gonna get the best reaction because of what he did there the first time, and just in general the trend of there's a group of protesters who are against foreigners. Why isn't his bodyguard not there? Then the other angle is like, Sokka's her boyfriend. Why didn't she come because of that? Like, real, there's no explanation given, and I think it's one of the worst decisions that was made in the entire run of the comics, full stop. It's just not very good at all. And one thing I will say, Bosco is here, and they do some really nice stuff with him throughout, just in terms of like visual kind of gags and kind of pointing out, you know, little bits and pieces with him in the background. Kind of like how they use Momo in a lot of the books and in the show. They use Bosco very well here as well, that he's always with Quay and so on. You know, Zuko walks in and we get some mention of the protesters, the foreigners, Zuko not getting the best reaction. But, you know, we see basically Gilak make his escape then in the other scene. Thawd is released and they're just kind of out there in the background. But again, like, that's part 1 and part 2. Major fights with Gilak's forces that they've lost completely. Just there's been no real issue at all whatsoever. There's been a few threats, but like, he's not the biggest threat in the world. Then we cut to the meeting with the world leaders and so on. But this is one of those things again where it's just like, okay, I get the Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom are the main people you have to deal with, but the book is called North and South. The Northern Water Tribe is involved with this project because of the connection to the South. Why is Chief Arnook there? Why is there no like representative of Chief Arnook? The book is not really about the Northern Water Tribe at all. It's because the Northern factor in this book is basically 2 people. And it's 2 people who themselves don't have that big of a connection to the North. Their perspective comes from being more familiar with like city living rather than like tribal living, and so it's just this kind of culture clash rather than the North versus South thing, and I think that becomes a bit of a problem. So they talk about, you know, their, you know, the future for the Southern Water Tribe, how they want to, you know, improve the economy and use their resources with partnerships with the other nations. And Zuko just says, you know, you can count the Fire Nation in, Hakoda. Your people have suffered so much destruction at our hands. We'd be grateful for the opportunity to help rebuild. Quay brings up the fact that the Earth Kingdom can't help as much because, you know, there's so many needs back in the Earth Kingdom because of the war. And, you know, the idea is he also kind of steps in a kind of Melina style and says, you know, like, the Southern Water Tribe is going to need to make measurable, concrete progress towards civilization, and Katara doesn't like the way he worded that at all. And he tries to, you know, explain it more clearly, but it doesn't come across all that well. But he basically just says after this, you know, in fact, we'd be honored to help the Southern Water Tribe develop into a cleaner, safer place, and warmer too. And Katara's about to rip into him again about, like, with all due respect, Your Majesty, compared to the outer ring of Bossing Say, the South Pole is as the next fight starts. But I like that reference of just, like, she's seen parts of the Earth Kingdom. The Southern Water Tribe, as it is now, as it was before, is better than aspects of that. So what remains of Gilak's forces, you know, come in, attack the meeting. Big fights go on. You know, we now have Zuko involved here. We have Toph. We have a lot of great Earthbenders involved here. They all get their nice moments. But there's so much chaos going on that they can't keep track of everyone. So what ends up happening is that Gilak kind of gets an advantage over Hakoda, who's injured and is kind of initially taken away. And this kind of distracts everyone, and they follow Hakoda's basically capture. Aang and Katara basically get him back by kind of, you know, initially hurting Gilak. But when they return back and, you know, Gilak escapes, they find out that Earth King Quay has been, you know, taken basically, and they have to do something to get him back. There's a ransom note that basically tells them to come to this bridge, the Bridge of No Return, and they'll do a trade. Basically, the what is it? They'll trade Hakoda for King Quay, and this will be how they kind of get their advantage here, because this is where they make the switch with Gilak as a character to completely removing his ideology from him, the fact that he has a good amount of support in the South, all that sort of stuff. They take it away and focus more on the fact that Gilak wants to take out Hakoda. They give a good reason in that, yes, it is because he thinks Hakoda is not suited to be leader, and he feels that the South needs a much more, you know, powerful in his mind leader who's willing to make the big actions and so on. Sokka is the one set with coming up with a plan, And when they get there, you know, just before the plan is executed, there's probably our best Sokka Katara moment in the entire book. Probably like the only notable one, really. And it's Katara just saying, "This isn't how I imagined our trip back home. I always assumed that once we defeated Fire Lord Ozai, the South Pole would go back to the way it was supposed to be. Our lives would go back to the way they're supposed to be." And she says, "But Gilak and these protesters and the unrest, now the whole thing, it's not like what I imagined." And Sokka just says, you know, "But you and I actually have no idea of what things were like here before the war. No one does, not even Gran Gran. What if the South Pole you're imagining, the one where everything's supposed to be, never actually existed?" And this is a really thought-provoking thing of just like, yeah, like the idea of like kind of Katara's nostalgia for the past and not really taking the full facts of everything into account. That, as I explained earlier on, the idea of like, yeah, they don't know about the war and how that really limited the development of the tribe, and now with the war over and the support of other nations, how the growth is going to be like 100 times bigger than what Katara expected, and so on. And obviously it begins to get to the root of like how it's supposed to be for Katara is with her mother still there, but she's gone, and that being the other angle to this. So part of the deal here is that all the benders have to allow themselves to be chi blocked. Sokka even gets chi blocked as well, as Hakoda is brought towards the center of the bridge to exchange himself with Quay. And this is when Gilak obviously goes crazy and betrays everyone, is about to cut the bridge, of course. But it's revealed that Melina and Toph's metalbending students are on the other side of the bridge, prepared to fight him, and they're gonna, you know, get the advantage here using their metal bending and so on. It's then revealed that another part of the plan was that all of the benders would wear this special armor that Sokka designed that would basically make them all immune to being chi blocked, in that it's special armor that makes it feel like you are chi blocked, because the armor would move and not just be this like solid plate. So it would feel like the chi blockers are actually like hitting something and getting the effect that they want. So the benders are now allowed to act. Melina fights with Gilak in the middle of the bridge as, you know, they try to get Quay to safety. Zuko rushes out as well. The bridge snaps though with all these people right in the middle of the bridge, and it's this really dramatic moment. What happens is that Zuko immediately saves Quay, so he's safe, and who's left on the bridge is Hakoda, Melina, and Gilak. And, you know, as this is going on, you know, Aang and Katara kind of go down to try and help, and Aang basically has to try on his glider to carry this whole group of people. On his own, he's trying to, like, with one hand carry Hakoda, Melina, and Gilak, who are all hanging on to each other. And something's going to have to give here. And so what happens is that Gilak tries to kill Melina while they're all hanging, and Melina's forced to let go of Gilak here, and so he just dies like that. It just happens. There's no real emotion to it beyond the fact that like everyone's aware that someone has just died here. But Aang's still losing his grip even with just Hakoda and Melina. And so Melina, you know, because she obviously loves Hakoda so much, lets go of him. Katara sees this, and I suppose sees the connection of Melina to her father, rushes out, really cool waterbending move over the ravine, saves Melina, and it's just thank you. That's the resolution of Melina and Katara's relationship in this entire book, basically. Never once really addressing the issues of like Melina is fundamentally behind a lot of these changes that are going to be made to her tribe. I get that they ultimately, at a basic level, what it came down to was Katara understanding that Melina does care about her father, and that's all that was really needed. But there needed to be a conversation here, more than just the action moment of Katara saving Melina because Melina basically saved Hakoda. It's a nice scene how it plays out. It's a great action scene, and in terms of Katara getting a great moment and how everyone's saved from the middle of the bridge and how it plays out. But it doesn't play massively well with the rest of the book, in my opinion. We then get to some other great moments. We get to Kaya's grave, so Katara and Sokka's mother's grave, and Katara says, when Sokka and I finally came back, I was hoping to find a home where everything's supposed to be everything's how it's supposed to be. But I realize now that just isn't possible, because a home where everything's how it's supposed to be is a home with you still in it, Mom. Yesterday I had to save this woman named Melina. You've never met her, she's different from you, really different, but I have a feeling you would have liked her. When I saved her, I felt a courage deep inside, a familiar sort of courage I felt when I fought Azula, when I saved Aang, when we left the Crystal Catacombs, and when Admiral Zhao killed the moon spirit we had to bring it back. That was your courage, Mom, the courage you passed on to me. Things are still changing here. I haven't yet convinced Dad and Melina not to build that own refinery, and the protesters haven't gone away. But through it all, I don't have to keep hoping for what's supposed to be, because you've been with me all along. And I think that's a really nice moment at the grave of Kaya. I don't like the end of it, where it basically is just in the middle of this heartfelt moment where we're addressing, Katara's feelings about her mother at this point in time and Melina. You suddenly say, oh yeah, and all this stuff, we're going to leave that wide open. Yeah, the oil refinery stuff that was important in part 2, the protesters, not getting any resolution on that. That's still present here. That wasn't what this book was about. And it's just like, but it was. That was the core of the plot in part 2. That's what everything revolved around, was the oil refinery, and it's just like unresolved. Sifu and Sora come up to Katara, and they kind of reveal that they are waterbenders. Katara gives them the speech, though, about, she says, you see, when I was little, the Fire Nation invaded our village. I still remember it. They really were monsters. They came to wipe out Southern-style waterbending off the face of the earth, and I was the South Pole's last waterbender. My mom sacrificed herself to keep me alive, and not just me. She died to make sure our way of bending has a chance to survive the future. Sura and Siku, I think that's why your mom sent you here. She wants you to be a part of that tradition that my mom helped save. And then they show off that they're actually quite skilled benders as well. And then we just end with this moment of like everyone in Gran Gran and Paku's hut, including King Kwei, Zuko, Toph, everyone. They just bring in food from all of the different nations, and we just end on this nice moment of everyone having a meal together. And it very much now, I think, knowing the context of what's happening production-wise, with a new creative team coming in, it makes sense why the ending felt so much like an ending, and why it didn't really feel like they were leaving stuff open as such. But coming to the end of this, it's a series that frustrates me, this one, because there was so much potential with just the idea of the return to the South. That's such a great idea. That's what got people invested in the first place. And so having it ultimately be such an inconsequential story come the end of it, that there are really, for me, only maybe 4 or 5 takeaway scenes from this book, and it's like 2 or 3 Hakoda and Katara scenes, like 1 Melina scene, and then like 1 or 2 Katara and Sokka scenes. The rest of it is kind of just like, what was the point of that? Gilak is just this villain who is like come and gone. Them not addressing the, I suppose, legacy that he may have left in the tribe is weird. I feel there should have been some sort of maybe like a flashback with Hakoda and Gilak, or they did something different with him. I didn't like the approach they took with Gilak towards the end of the book, where they turned him from being this guy presenting like the tough questions of like, he has a point, he has these ideals that oppose everything else going on, and no one can really give a great answer to oppose him. They turned that into him just being this madman out to kill Hakoda, and it ruined his character for me. Thankfully, of course, in a way, the book didn't really revolve around Gilak all that much, but then what was the book really about? Because the only takeaways are that, okay, the South is creating a partnership with the Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom, but we don't even know the full extent of necessarily where that is actually going, because it's a very political type thing. So the takeaway from this is kind of that, like, Katara has changed very subtly to now being more accepting of things, but still opposing a lot of what was going on. And it's just this weird angle of like, Katara got past nostalgia, but still logically has all these issues with fundamentally what's going on. And it's such a in a way, it's a bit of a mess come the end of the book. That the main character was Katara, and even her arc is such a subtle arc for a 3-part series that has like 216 pages. So it ends up just being this series where, like, what was it actually about? It's called North and South, but it wasn't really about the Northern Water Tribe and the Southern Water Tribe. It was only really about the Southern Water Tribe and like the impact of other things on it. Like, I'm coming across really negative because I think it's just disappointing that we don't get these books too often. We only have 5 comic series across 5 years. We don't get them that regularly. And then for one of them to be this disappointing, that's a huge disappointment because it basically made up a year of comics for us. And especially it being the last one, it feels really bad that the team went out on probably its lowest note, whereas like all the other series are actually very high notes. And again, I wouldn't say that this is bad. I still like this series a lot. There's some great Hakoda moments. He's very well characterized throughout this. Katara's great. Melina's a great new character that they introduced. But it's things like Malik not being in the last part. Them not really addressing what happened to him or where we're going. It just really feeling like this dead end. And going into a new creative team, I hope that they address some of the stuff here. I hope that the new creative team doesn't just start their own group of stories. That they use the fact that Gene Yang and Team Gira Hoover have set up a decent amount of stuff, and they, while also telling their own stories, approach dealing with what he has set up before as well. Because there's a lot of great stuff set up here and in the other comics. I don't want that to be forgotten just because one creative team is gone and a new one has come in. But that's been the video for today, so thanks for watching, and bye.